welcome everyone to the second in the Freethinker series of Freethought History webinars. My name is Daniel. I'm the editor of the Freethinker and your host this evening. On the screen, you should be able to see our website and social media links. If you haven't checked them out before, please do so at your leisure. Just so you're aware, this session is being recorded. It will go up on our YouTube channel and our website afterwards. And I had a note here to say, bear with me on the technical aspects, though I believe I've already messed some of those up. So apologies for the slight delay. So here's how this webinar will work. I will hand off to our guest tonight. He will give a talk for about 40 minutes. And then I shall open it up to the audience who can make comments and ask their questions. Our guest tonight, who you can see on the screen, is Eoin Carter, who has just completed his PhD in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Cambridge. His thesis examined attitudes to science and religion among Richard Carlile and other pioneers of the British Freethought movement. He's also a council member of the National Secular Society. And tonight he'll be talking about some of the historical links between Freethought and evolutionary thought. So with that out of the way, I will hand over now to Eoin.
Hello, can you hear me? Great. Sorry, I had to ask permission to get unmuted there. Sorry about that. Okay, thanks, Daniel, for the opportunity to speak. I am very grateful to be sharing some of the work that I've been doing over the course of my PhD here. I will now share these slides, so hopefully this is all going to work very nicely. Is this? Yeah, everyone happy with this? We're on a slide saying free thought and evolution. Lovely stuff. I'll get into it. Okay, so we're all here with the Freethinker this evening, and accordingly, I want to begin tonight with a legendary clash between science and religion. You may well have heard of it already. In 1860, less than a year after the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, a vicious debate broke out at the Oxford annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford and son of the revered abolitionist William Wilberforce, spoke furiously against T.H. Huxley, then a young scientist who would later become known as Darwin's bulldog, for his defense of the theory of natural selection. Wilberforce incredulously asked Huxley whether he descended from monkeys on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side. Huxley stood up unfazed, defended Darwin's theory, then stunned the crowd by declaring he'd rather be descended from an ape than be connected to a man like Wilberforce, who turned his talents to obscuring the truth. Such was the shock that Lady Brewster, wife of the eminent Scottish scientist Sir David Brewster, fainted. Now, when I described that clash as legendary, I meant just that. Almost nothing in what I've said was accurate. Wilberforce and Huxley weren't in a face-to-face debate over Darwinism. They were two among a number of respondents who spoke after a fairly underwhelming paper by John William Draper, an English chemist who had attempted to connect Darwinian evolution to the long run of European intellectual development. The room in which the discussion took place was crowded and noisy. No transcripts survive, and although eyewitness accounts generally agree Huxley said something like that monkey zinger, the rest of his speech seems to have been fairly forgettable. That the incident took on much significance instead owes a lot to Huxley's own efforts to anchor a particular narrative of what happened through his own writings, through anecdotes ceded to friends and other writers, and his own later public career as an advocate for scientific authority. Now, perhaps you saw that twist coming. Leaving aside the details, we all know that the world is more complex than frothing priests, cool collected scientists, and ladies in crinoline fainting. The reason that myth continues to circulate around our collective memory is Huxley's reason, that even if it's wrong in the details, it feels somehow in service of a greater truth or alleged truth. that the 19th century was the scene of new clashes between religion and science, and that many of these centered exactly on the questions about humanity's place in nature explored in Darwin's work. What I want to challenge in this talk, however, is the idea that those clashes were a response to Darwin. Instead, I'm going to present an alternative picture, one in which evolutionary ideas were already causing public controversy as early as the 1820s, when Darwin had barely finished his studies as an undergraduate. We'll see how a number of writers and lecturers were already exploring the idea that living beings, including humans, were the end products of wholly natural processes, perhaps without any originating creator at all. Crucially, many of these were free thinkers, outside of mainstream religious belief, and often involved in radical political campaigning as well. In other words, we'll be exploring the idea that Darwinian evolution was not the cause of a theological scientific crisis in Britain, but a response to one that was already raging. That is an idea that has become increasingly mainstream in academic histories of evolution over the last 40-odd years, but one that has struggled to break through into wider culture. So my talk tonight draws upon that scholarship, as well as some of the research that's I've conducted in my own PhD. So the way I see this going is we're going to first begin with a few biographical notes on Darwin. He is, after all, a figure who casts a shadow over the entire century. And so we just need to kind of anchor a feeling of when the major events of Darwin's career happened so that we can see the significance of what happened earlier. So we'll begin with that, and then starting with some thinkers active in the 1780s and 1790s, we're going to see how elements of this evolutionary or transformist thought kept cropping up in free thinking spaces over the next 80 years or so. Okay, so let's begin with Darwin. He's born in 1809 into a largely Unitarian family of dissenting intelligentsia, of whom we'll see one shortly. Brought up in comfortable circumstances. In 1825, he's sent to join his elder brother, Erasmus, at the medical school at the University of Edinburgh for an ill-fated attempt to train him for a physician, not helped by the fact that he hated the sight of blood. Perhaps recognizing that was not going to happen, the family instead arranged to send him to Christ's College, Cambridge, where he completed his degree from 1828 to 1831. However, his real passion in the course of that, as well as running up debts to the despair of his father and horse riding, was a love of natural historical collecting, making contacts there that would serve him through the rest of his life. After a hasty spell of cramming, when he realized things were about to get real in 1831, he did fairly well in his exams, but it was clear he had no desire to proceed on to the clergy. Instead, however, he was presented with an opportunity that would really change his life, to join HMS Beagle on its 5-year surveying voyage around the world, with him essentially there as a sort of amateur naturalist, but more importantly, gentleman's companion to Captain Fitzroy, a rare equal in the otherwise extremely regimented and hierarchical naval structure. So he was there as much as a sort of sounding board, specifically because as a gentleman of leisure, he was outside the traditional hierarchies of naval discipline. His return to London saw him embedding himself in the heart of a natural historical network that stretched worldwide, beginning to publish, making his name with both his Beagle notes and also a series of specialist publications on natural history, especially corals. It's at this time that also earlier elements that were proved, earlier texts that would prove formative on him began to enter into his reading, especially Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, which Darwin seems to have encountered around 1838, which gave him the mathematics to really impress upon him the enormous power of a contest over limited resources among populations that are predisposed always to multiply geometrically faster than any rate of sustenance can increase. In 1842, he arrived at the first pencil sketch of a theory that he had been developing over the preceding decade, that species might change over historical time. This was something he kept very closely guarded initially, for reasons that we'll explore later in this talk. As he would say later, a couple of years later in 1844, to his good friend Joseph Dalton Hooker, the belief that species were not immutable was like confessing murder. 1844, as we'll also see later, was an important year because it was the year in which an anonymous book caused a literary scandal and sensation in the UK and further afield. Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published anonymously, sketched out a developmental cosmology that began with the idea that that stars condensed from diffuse celestial matter settled into forms like stars, like planets in orbits, subject to developing astronomical conditions, and that life too underwent developmental processes, that ultimately the complexity that one could find in the natural world in our own time was the process of essentially mechanistic forces determined by the properties of matter. It was not explicitly an atheistic text, but that it was so easily capable of being read as a materialist rejection of divine creation helped add to its notoriety. So the Vestiges controversy is one reason why Darwin was determined to only publish when he felt his case was unanswerable. As many people probably know, he would sit on that until effectively bounced into things by a letter from the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace that arrived in the late 1850s, rather forcing Darwin's hand, as he would otherwise perhaps have sat on his theory only to be published posthumously. Now, we'll come back to Vestiges and its significance later, but this is just to understand the sort of the key beats, the idea that is that Darwin has the rudiments of a theory by the 1830s. By the 1840s, there's a large public controversy underway about evolutionary narratives. And so now we're going to see some roots to how those arose. And we're going to begin, in fact, with Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. So Erasmus Darwin, physician, writer, country gent, was a key figure in what's been known as the Midlands Enlightenment. He was enormously influential in establishing literary and philosophical societies around the Midlands. The Darwins themselves settled around Lichfield, but Erasmus also helped found the Derby Philosophical Society, among others. He was a writer in the Enlightenment tradition of enormous optimism. So although he was a rather free-thinking, deistic writer in his own personal views, he developed a cosmology effectively founded on joy. That might sound a little strange. Essentially, the picture that Darwin imagined for the early years of the Earth was of a planet that was initially completely aquatic, seeded with tiny filaments. These would be effectively the seeds of life, seeds that had initially only the power to respond to irritation or stimulation. As they did so, they developed locomotion. Over generations, they gradually became more complex as that motion led to changes in their own composition. But essentially, it's a sort of upwardly mobile vision of life being compelled by the sheer vitality of feeling as one develops to the point of having aquatic animals that can not just reproduce themselves, but move around and become larger and larger and begin to fix outside matter. Darwin's view is that, and he was inspired specifically by corals in this instance, that as those generations grew larger and larger and decayed, you essentially have the coral remnants descending gravitationally to the core of an aqueous planet, which produces over long time the rock that can then sustain vegetable life, and on the back of that, animal life. So it's an interesting picture in which life effectively produces the earth in some ways. And certainly life produces its own environment and then reacts to it. Darwin, he published these views in a 2-volume treatise called Zoonomia, i.e. like the laws of animal life, which was published, as you can see, right in the year of his death. He had also aired them in more poetic modes, in long poems with hefty footnotes. The Loves of Plants, which was then republished as The Botanic Garden throughout the revolutionary 1790s and later. And then The Temple of Nature, published immediately after his death, took that and ran with it further. These works, more accessible, much cheaper, were widely circulated then throughout the 1810s and the 1820s, and we'll see them come up again. But I think the take home for Erasmus Darwin is this sense of life as self-organizing, and life as essentially thrilling, reveling in its own feeling. Some of that strand of self-development would be seen with another thinker, often the one who's presented as something of a foil to Darwin, Charles Darwin, and that's Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, somebody whose career was really made by the French Revolution. He had, after an earlier military career, in the late 1780s, arrived at the position of keeper of the herbarium of the Royal Garden in Paris. He managed to survive the change of government, let's say, and in 1793 was made curator and professor of invertebrate zoology at the Paris Natural History Museum. That positioned him ideally to benefit from the flood of specimens that then surged into Paris and into the Natural History Museum in particular over the next decade. As Napoleon's armies traveled around Europe, they were accompanied by a litany of, let's say, acquisition specialists who brought home effectively everything they thought worth taking. This would also be the making of, for example, Georges Cuvier, the anatomist, who would be one of the most influential authors on life and its forms for decades to come. So taking Lamarck in particular, from his position as professor of invertebrate zoology, he had access to geological excavations in the massive limestone basin in which Paris sits. And around 1800, he began to commit himself publicly to the idea that species were not fixed in time and type, and did in fact change. He first he aired these in a lecture in 1800, publishing them later as Researches into the Organization of Living Bodies in 1802, which would begin to sketch out the core of his theory that he would then expand on later in the Philosophie zoologique in 1809, which was widely published and retranslated, along with a later, more specialist 7-volume history of invertebrate animals that was published from 1815 to 22. Now, what's interesting in Lamarck is, in some ways, he is running in exactly the opposite direction to Erasmus Darwin, where Darwin started with a liquid earth that gradually solidified with the corpses of living beings. Lamarck took his cue in the other way. Around 1802, he had also published a work on hydrogeology, and his own theory ran in the opposite direction. He had observed how the action of fluids, especially the oceans, could change even something as apparently solid as the rock of the earth over long times. So he had a picture of a steady state earth very gradually being moved around by the fluids that swirled over its surface. He would take this idea that fluids can reshape inorganic beings and then begin to apply it to the inner bodies of living beings. So this was instead something that operated on the idea, which was that life essentially was the circulation of fluids. It wasn't a vital principle that was put into them by a creator. That actually all one can see in living beings of whatever nature is circulation, contraction, and dilation. So whereas Lamarck is often presented with this kind of modern gloss of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, it's not really a fair depiction of his own thought. As Pietro Corsi, the major historian of his thought, has pointed out, instead, it's an obsession with fluid and circulation that defines Lamarck's work. And in particular, it gives rise to two related phenomena. One is the belief that fluid circulation inherently tends to complexity. So the idea that what starts off as a very simple pulse, say, or the fluids that pass through a plant, that fluid itself predisposes tissue to split. A split allows a more complex form of sensation or locomotion. And over deep time, these processes lead to a continuous chain of life, which gets ever more complex. Alongside that master narrative, we have a much more local one to do with use or atrophy. And this is what gives rise to the inherited characteristics depiction. The idea that if I am straining for something, okay, if I'm a giraffe straining my neck, in doing that, I am exercising my tissues. I am essentially inflaming them, directing more liquid toward them. And that agitation will be reflected in the life force that I then communicate to my offspring, which in Lamarck's case, it's a vision of sort of energetic semen that then changes the embryo as it develops. The details are a bit squirrely and quite gruesome, actually, but the point is Lamarck is operating in, on the one hand, a similar kind of tradition, and on the other, in completely the opposite direction. He is also a materialist in the old school mode. He hadn't quite reconciled himself to modern chemistry, for example. So he was still talking in terms of materialism as the four elements of the classics: earth, air, fire, and water. These being effectively principles that one can discern in different types of matter. But he was not somebody thinking in post-Lavoisier oxygen or carbon, for example. Now, whereas Lamarck and Darwin are fairly well known, we're going to shift to somebody who's rather more obscure now in the person of Sir Richard Phillips. Phillips is the first, I would say, really recognizable radical in the capital F freethinker tradition that we're going to be talking about today, because he did time for the Paynite cause. In the 1790s, he was both the founder and editor of the Leicester Herald, a radical newspaper. He did 18 months in prison for selling Tom Paine's Rights of Man. And then he underwent an abrupt career change on getting out. He was committed always to the idea of education as advancing the interests of working people, and threw himself into educational publishing instead, with such success that in 1807 he was elected sheriff of the city of London, an honorific post, but it got him his knighthood and makes him one of the only Paynite radicals to do so. Alongside his conventional educational publishing, which made him a decent amount of money, Phillips was also working on his own theories, which were a little more heterodox, let's say. So in particular, he didn't believe in Newtonian gravitation. He did not think it was possible for matter to attract other matter across the universe. Instead, he insisted on a vision of essentially the billiard ball universe scaled up, that only mechanical impulse could be an adequate physical explanation for a phenomenon. He simply rejected the idea of forces acting at a distance. He also believed that Isaac Newton had effectively fudged the numbers to make his mechanics work by inventing the vacuum, which Phillips believed to be a physical impossibility. So he thought space was utterly full. So even as I'm moving my hands around now, in reality, they are moving through rarefied, not very dense, gaseous matter, but that is still necessarily full. Now, on a much larger scale, one consequence of this is that the motions of the planets, for example, rearrange them are not the result of forces acting radially in conjunction with the inertia of already moving bodies. Instead, the way that the Earth orbits the sun is it is spinning around like that. The surface of the Earth is pulling its atmospheric layer around with it. That is pulling what we would mistakenly call outer space around with it. And ultimately, there's physical contiguity right toward the sun, which is itself necessarily spinning to sustain the entire solar system in this kind of motion. That might all sound a little bit out there and unprovable, but what makes Phillips interesting is that he worked from his cosmos into determinate consequences for the Earth. The way that this shook out in his understanding is that because the oceans of the Earth are more mobile, they would slosh around in such a way that they would, over time, as well as being the cause of the precession of Earth's orbital axis, if you know what that is, it would also result in the Earth's axial tilt shifting over time, that the water of the Earth's oceans would gradually slosh toward one pole and to the other, back again, over a cycle that took about 25,000 years. This is one way that Phillips, to give himself a little theological fig leaf, could explain the flood as surely having happened historically, just as part of a larger celestial motion. But one consequence of this is that effectively no human civilization could exist for longer than 25,000 years, because all traces of it would be destroyed as water sloshed back and forth. He himself was accused by some readers of effectively subjecting all of Earth's life to mass death as a consequence. He himself seems to have been a bit more of an optimist and reckoned that over the course of a couple of generations, because this stuff doesn't happen quickly, that everything could slosh itself out. But one other link that makes him a kind of intermediate figure with Lamarck, whom Phillips read, whom Phillips seems to have translated, he in fact seems to be one of the earliest English authors to engage with Lamarck, publishing and noting Lamarck's accordance with Phillips' own theories within 4 years of publication, was the idea that this universal sloshing also reconfigures the Earth. It produces better and better soil every time this happens, which is capable of explaining why more and more complex life forms are to be found in the Earth. So we've got the beginnings there of quite a key argument that astronomy drives geological change, and it drives it in a cyclic way that is also compatible with a master narrative of greater improvement, greater complexity over historical time. Now we're going to go even more obscure here to somebody who read Phillips. In fact, probably the person who responded more closely to Phillips than anyone else did, Samson Arnold Mackie, a shoemaker from Norwich, who, after a long and hard life as a soldier and then a shoemaker and essentially broke autodidact, began in the 1820s to publish a series of works on astronomy, beginning with the mythological astronomy of the ancients demonstrated. He was responding to Phillips's work. He didn't know he was responding to Phillips's work because he was actually responding to Phillips's Wonders of the Heavens, published in 1821 under a pseudonym as the Reverend C.C. Clarke. This was a literary alter ego of Phillips. And in that, Mackie recoiled at the idea that Phillips had offered that the axial tilt of the Earth changing over time was an adequate explanation for why one could find the fossil remnants of apparently tropical species in Northern Europe. he reckoned essentially that Phillips was just simply wrong in his physics, and offered his own sort of hybrid, not Newtonian, but not as non-Newtonian as Phillips, to explain his own orbital motions, where instead Mackey presented what he called a pericyclosical motion, whereby the Earth's axis, if you like, not only precessed around in the way that we believe it to now, but that the axial tilt was increasing over time, going further and further and further down to the point that it actually passed down through the equator plane, and resulted in a full inversion and then cycled back up. Now, what made Mackey's claims interesting is not just the fact that this was a sort of unprecedented belief that the Earth's conditions had changed as much as that over time, but also his source. His major source was not geology, in which he had no training and no reading whatsoever, really, but astronomy, and specifically what he believed about the history of Indian astronomy. He was reading the works of British Orientalists, so William Jones, Thomas Morris, and assorted other figures who had been making the antiquity of Indian astronomy. That was one of the major discoveries to come out of British engagement with Indian thought in the 1810s and the 1820s. And Mackey reckoned that the long yuga cycles described in ancient Sanskrit texts actually corresponded to the pericyclosical motion he was describing. So Earth would undergo an age of horror when its axis lay in the plane of what would otherwise be its equator, because one side of the Earth would just be scoured, relentlessly subjected to sunlight for half a year, to the level that everything would burn off, and the other half would be caught in freezing darkness. So for the several thousand years in which that process was in that intermediate situation, effectively life would be wiped off and scoured off the face of the Earth. Conversely, in the position of absolute verticality for the pole, that was a golden age that Mackey perceived as being a circumstance in which effectively everywhere was subjected to an ideal tropical amount of sunlight, and would result in cultural flourishing. So what's interesting here is that Mackey took from this, he believed profoundly that the Indian astronomers of antiquity were right, and that they were encoding historical experience. So humanity was necessarily at least as old as the longest cycle, and he believed actually twice that, which put an existence for the Earth at about 8 million years, which obviously sounds small by our own lights, but this was a major departure, well, certainly from Christian orthodoxy. And yet at the same time, it wasn't the kind of insistence on an eternal Earth that an earlier thinker like Elihu Palmer, active around 1802, had also suggested. This is a new kind of situation. It's not that Earth is infinitely old. It is merely very, very, very old. And like Erasmus Darwin, whose thought he seems to have had some kind of interaction with, he also had an image of an Earth that began as entirely aquatic, and then gradually, except in Mackey's case, he believed it began with vegetable life, and that a kind of skin of algae and plant matter developed initially, calcified, those became proto-continents, and then we got the major oceans when Earth got captured by the sun, and the gravitational whiplash of that tore that skin apart. It collapsed down, and that gave us the Andes on one rim of the Pacific, and was the reason why, for example, the coast of Africa and the coast of South America seemed to match. So he was a highly original thinker. He did not himself have a huge amount to say about life, except that he believed that it arose spontaneously from the productions of matter, and that necessarily it was utterly progressive. He would, in that sense, he was content to sort of leave the rest to Erasmus Darwin. Now, these two thinkers, Phillips and Mackey, were to find a strange kind of union in perhaps a more familiar figure from radicalism, Richard Carlile, who the arch infidel of the 1820s and 1830s, who established the Republican and later the Lion as some of the most influential free-thinking Republican, anti-establishment, irreligious magazines that the UK has ever seen. He did decades in prison for his trouble. He's been written about ably and well by far more trained historians than me. But what I'm interested in particular is the letter pages of the Republican. Those were the main fodder for my PhD, and in particular, the philosophical space that they opened up. As you've seen, we've had a kind of slight downward class trajectory over the generations here. You know, Lamarck, pretty well-heeled. Erasmus Darwin, likewise. We've descended a level to Richard Phillips, and then to Samson Arnold Mackie. And Richard Carlile, through his editorial policy of effectively say what you like, write in what you like, the Republican became an unprecedentedly open philosophical space for people to explore these kind of ideas of species change. So we see, for example, Erasmus Darwin's poetry being quoted there, people coming up with and picking apart the idea that life is progressive, attempting to unite that with what they took from Mackie, which was effectively to ignore everything he had to say about myth and just treat it as a secular theory of time that confirmed that the Earth was both very old and underwent periodic scourings where life got destroyed. If you couple that with a kind of Erasmus Darwin upwardly progressive, optimistic materialism, or a Richard Phillips inspired by Lamarck story of animal vitality driven by the circulation of fluids, also getting more complex over time. These factors unite to produce an Earth which is like periodically scoured by its astronomical conditions and reforms better and more complex, hence providing the Carlyleans an adequate philosophical answer to their great problem, which is, if life is meant to be so endlessly perfectible, why is it so terrible in our own time? So the idea that actually you might just be at a certain point in a renewal cycle, and that the Earth could still be plenty old, long enough to contradict the Christians, but you happen just to be at the point where this latest iteration of life had become aware of the pointlessness of its prior religious beliefs, provided an astronomical geological solution to a problem that plagued anybody who was both radical, optimistic, and fighting with no apparent success against monarchy and religion in their own time. So another important figure who comes out of this period is Carlyle's bankroller, his funder, along with Julian Hibbert, William Devonshire Saull, who was a city brandy merchant and skilled amateur geologist in his own right. He essentially took up with Phillips and ran with it, because whereas Phillips was perfectly prepared to throw out a new system of physics on the fly, Saull actually knew what he was talking about. He was a very careful, conscientious geological collector. And he took this line of radical argument to something more approaching a general theory of development. He also, as described wonderfully in Adrian Desmond's recent book, Reign of the Beast, operated a geological museum in London that you could visit for free and have this story of life progressing through geological time perfectibly upwards that was open to everybody. And the fact that Desmond has effectively been able to find something that was sat there as an open secret in the heart of London and yet being almost entirely neglected in the history of geology is pretty astonishing, really. One of Saull's other major provocations was he actually, unlike Huxley, was fully prepared to say that, yeah, man had a monkey ancestor. And he was doing so decades before that exchange that we began with in Oxford. So Saull, if you like, is the culmination of different strands, different tendencies, arguments that begin with astronomy and end with geology as the encoding of periodic renewals or resets in upward cycles of life. He therefore was the major figure before Vestiges to be talking in such kind of irreligious, materialist, upwardly progressive narratives. Returning finally now to Vestiges, it was a work written by Robert Chambers of the Chambers Publishing House in Edinburgh. However, he kept his name concealed for decades afterwards. Chambers did not set out to write an irreligious work. As mentioned, it was certainly read as materialist by most of his critics, but it was drawing on and offering a kind of argument that in itself could be reconciled with the idea of a creator who acts through natural law. And yet, because the well had been so thoroughly poisoned by the last couple of thinkers that we've just seen, it received an almost entirely hostile reception. Not helped by the fact that Chambers made the paradigm mistake in these things, and that he actually went into detail and attempted to spell out the precise mechanisms by which species might develop over time. Not something that the previous thinkers had ever troubled to do. Okay, so drawing this together, we have gone over a span of about 60 years. And what can we say about it? Firstly, and I think this sort of shakes out of the kind of the class context that we've seen, environment matters. You can only react to something, you can only be inspired by it or reject it if you encounter it in the first place. Lamarck, as a figure, while he was being discussed, for example, in the medical schools in the 1820s, only really came into this more insurgent working class milieu through Phillips. And often it was people responding to Phillips without the awareness that he was in some cases just channeling Lamarck, because Phillips, while he was capable of many things, generous citation was not one of them. Another way of looking at this is that it's not so much who you're reading as where you're reading. One can look both at Phillips or a figure like Carlyle as essentially knowledge brokers, figures of interchange. Their major contribution was to bring material that had been published in French 20 years earlier and take some of those ideas and put them in a context which was already questioning or outright hostile to religious claims, where we can then see a sort of subsequent blossoming. So it's, I think, important to get away here from the idea that this is just Lamarckism, for example, or Erasmian Darwinism. There's something more important here. The fact that such texts are having to cross linguistic barriers, class barriers, literary barriers, changes them fundamentally. And what we see in the kind of the vitality, creativity, idiosyncrasy of writers like Phillips or Mackie or Carlyle is the fact that they are anxious for anything they can get their hands on, but they are defined by scarcity at the same time. And I think I'm mindful of time, so instead I want to leave as much room for possible questions, so I'll stop there and say thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Owen, for a fascinating talk. When you mentioned Mackie's Age of Horror, I couldn't help but feel that we're kind of going through one right now in a political and social sense. But leaving that aside, let's open it up to questions and comments from the audience. So if you just raise your hand physically or use the button or type in the chat box, I'll try and get to you. Oh, Charles.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
That was a fascinating talk, Owen, and I really responded to it. I have, as my great-great-grandfather, Archdeacon Philip Freeman, who was a conservative theologian who opposed Darwin by arguing that the fossils were created at the same time as Adam and Eve, and in order to deliberately offend the unbelievers. I'm very pleased to say that my cousin, Richard Brooke Freeman, also took the opposite view and published a great deal of bibliographical details of Darwin's works. But it was a fascinating talk, and it inspires me to learn very much more about these individuals that you've so eloquently discussed.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think one thing to make a point of here is work like this, work in this area has become so much easier in the last couple of decades in particular. The careful work of generations of previous scholars pulling together, for example, the Darwin Correspondence Project that's run out of the University Library here in Cambridge, which means that now you can read all correspondence that survives to and from Darwin. And that was an important thing. Initially, the project was framed as just letters by Darwin. An early funder insisted it'd be both ways. And now anybody, wherever you are in the world, can just follow up any link, any glimmer of interest in this in a way that is sort of unimaginable even 30 years ago.
I think I saw Bill with his hand up.
I'm interested in whether you've come across any influence of Schopenhauer. Thinking of Mackey, for instance, it's interesting his interest in the Indian astronomers. I'm just wondering if there was any cross-fertilization with Schopenhauer, either with Mackey or the other people that you've been talking about.
So with Mackey, I don't think so. He is, however, the only group outside of the Carlyleans who take up Mackey's thought are the Theosophists. He's actually taken and read, not really for his astronomy, but for his mythography, by Blavatsky. He's cited in Isis Unveiled. Otherwise, he seems to have had a pretty solitary, pretty hard life still. He lived in an attic where he continued to do his work as a shoemaker. He was sort of brought into Norwich Literary Society a little bit, and seems to have taken the occasional trip to London, but no, otherwise he is just, and his only other appearance is in The Last Man, where there's a quite harsh caricature of him presented by Mary Shelley as a kind of doomsayer who is too busy expounding on his astronomical theories to realize that the world is actually, in this case, literally ending around him.
Robert Stovold, hello.
I was just wondering, obviously, some of these sort of proto-evolution ideas that you mentioned, they haven't held up very well in with the benefit of hindsight and in the light of modern knowledge. But what do you think the factors were at about that time that caused other people to be coming up with these ideas? So, for example, Darwin and Wallace were both visiting islands and seeing different species, and so you can understand some commonality there. Would the example of Napoleon's army sort of providing specimens be another example of that, where people are seeing more variation than they saw before? And
So in the specific case of Napoleon's armies, it's a tricky one because so I mentioned Georges Cuvier, and he is in an even more privileged and supreme position in Paris than Lamarck is, and yet Cuvier is one of the most insistent figures that comparative anatomy actually shows no change in species, that one might find different species that one could assign to different moments of creation, for example, but and as probably the sort of the reigning king of comparative anatomy for decades, his reputation mattered an awful lot in closing that down as a line of argument. So I don't think it's necessarily produced by access to new specimens, let's say. There certainly is something in the fact that it's from about the 1780s that you begin to get fossil discoveries being pursued in more systematic ways, and crucially also that's hand in hand with the development of stratigraphic geology. So it's not just the fact that you're finding unusual species, but you're finding that they tend to occur in certain types of rock, which are layered always in the same sequence wherever you are. And so there's a kind of pivotal period in the 1820s. The historian of geology, Martin Rudwick, has written several doorstopper books on this called Exploding the Limits of Time, which is adapting a quote by Cuvier, in which one could kind of insist until about 1820 that geological evidence didn't tell you irrefutably that the Earth was necessarily millions of years old. That position is so much harder to maintain by the mid-1820s. And by the 1830s, it's the working as practices of most geologists, even if they won't fully say it publicly, are that, yeah, the Earth necessarily must be several millions of years old, if not older. So there's a kind of transformation happening in other spheres, which changes the whole timescale. What's interesting about this crowd is because they don't have access to that, they're not that well connected. They're instead leaning on these kind of astronomical arguments. Right. And it's a different route to the same necessary thing of time being much longer.
Yeah.
Bob Forder.
Well done, Eoin.
Thanks.
Very much. How do you see the impact of these people you've talked about this evening on the freethinkers of what the Americans call the heroic phase of free thought at the end of the 19th century? In other words, what influence did they have on Bradlaugh and his ilk at the end of the 19th century? How did they influence mainstream freethinkers, radicals, secularists?
So I would say their influence is, if anything, a negative one. One group that I didn't have time to talk about in my main talk, but who are effectively the heirs to Lamarck, are William Chilton and Charles Southwell and a young George Jacob Holyoake, who are involved in an explicitly atheistical magazine, The Oracle of Reason, in the early 1840s. And as Adrian Desmond has described in some of his earlier work in the 1980s, they pursued a series of articles on what they called a theory of regular gradation, the idea that species in the fossil record attest to an upward and changing flow of light. And that was explicitly Lamarckian because by the late 30s, Lamarck had broken out from radicals in the medical schools to be much more widely accessible. And then the Oracle stuff was notorious, right? These articles come out a couple of years before Vestiges, and it's the 1840s are a sort of pivotal moment where the idea that exploring evolution means pugnacious, combative materialism is really at its acme. And this is one reason why I think it's a real moment of relief as much as anything else, when Darwin provides in Origin an account of species change, which is not only scientifically comprehensive, but does not follow it up with God's dead, no kings. And so I think really it's the fact that nobody has any particular desire to go back to that. I think that, Holyoake then later in his career pulls away from that kind of hostile provocation. And I think also the difference is that whereas up till and including Vestiges, you can publish in a non-expert sense because the only people publishing are non-experts without reputations to lose. Whereas by the 1860s and 70s, let's say, you've got Darwin and his commentators and expositors able to provide you scientifically coherent messaging at whatever level, from elite practitioners to popular summaries in the penny magazine. And so I think the radicalism has moved on, and there's not the desire nor the skill set really to return to this kind of earlier provocation. The barrier to entry to become a qualified participant in those later post-Darwin evolutionary debates is much higher.
All right, I think time for just one more question from John Sargent.
This has been fascinating. Thank you. And I had no idea that the level of discussion and debate around this issue was going on around Darwin. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about how Darwin, if he did engage with all these different discussions, and to what extent he was able to play that off the development of his own very original ideas, particularly when he was away on the Beagle and when he came back. I mean, I had this rather ill-informed notion that he just disappeared and came up with this amazing theory and came back and it shocked the world. Clearly not the case.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's Darwin's relationship to materialism is one that there's a lot of time spent interpreting a handful of private comments that he made to himself, or to trusted friends. So his closest brush to Carlyle, for example, happens in quite a well-known incident in 1829, where Carlyle and his ally, the Reverend Robert Taylor, otherwise known as the Devil's Chaplain, go on an infidel missionary tour, and their first port of call outside London is Cambridge, and they nail a challenge to the university's divines, saying, come and engage us in theological debate, come debate me, bro. And Darwin is there. And one sees later, in a letter he writes to Joseph Hooker in 1855, a comment on the apparent cruelty or sheer degree of suffering, let's say, non-intentional suffering, directionless suffering. And he makes a note like, what a work a devil's chaplain would make of this. And now that quotation has been run with. Richard Dawkins took it up as a title. That's one brush. But we have no proof that, Darwin had paid any attention. He may not even been around at the particular moment. Also hidden away in his private notes, there's a little moment where he's speculating on species non-fixity, and he chides himself and he says, oh, naughty materialist. And that's sort of it in terms of the traces that he left. However, he was somebody who was acutely conscious. He was not one to get involved in public controversy. And so for him to come out with something where he's saying, these atheists don't have it, here's how natural selection works, would be to drag a gentleman of impeccable social standing, even to show that he's aware of it, would be hazardous. There's also the fact that, like, you know, his correspondence comes to us mediated through successive generations. And so all you need is one descendant who's handling your papers to feel uncomfortable with references to someone they don't like, and it won't survive, and you won't have any clue. So it's always been the case, unfortunately, that there's no smoking gun, there's no private notebook in the same way that there is for, you know, for Darwin's engagements with Malthus, say. And instead we're feeding off scraps. We certainly know what he made of Vestiges, but Vestiges, as I've put across, is not quite the kind of inflammatory work that some of this other stuff is. But Vestiges' reputation is affected by it nonetheless, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
All right, I said one more, but Akash has raised his hand. So if we if you'll indulge us, let's have just one more, one last.
Hey, I don't know if can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Long time no see, Eoin. I had a quick question about Darwin's relationship with Marx, because I'm not sure if they had a vague interaction or something, and I wanted to know the extent to which Marx's understanding of a materialist analysis of, say, social forces came into contact with Darwin's, I guess, I don't know, trepidation with materialism, and also in regard to the general Darwinian erasure and all the build-up to Origin of Species for the last like 60 years and all the people you mentioned. Why do you think this has been so understudied, and why do you think the erasure has happened?
Okay, I'll take the second bit first. There's a phenomenon known as the Darwinian eclipse, which occurs from roughly the 1880s to the 1920s. The problem is, after the stunning achievement that is the Origin of Species and then the Descent of Man, people then struggle to really do much with Darwin's thought. What would later be described as the modern synthesis, where the general mechanism of natural selection is then paired with an actual mechanism for heredity in the right kind of way that produces random variations that can then be selected upon. That's something that only happens as a result of work in genetics in the 1910s and 1920s. And the phrase modern synthesis is coined by Julian Huxley, a later member of that family, in 1942, something like that. Something interesting that you see is that actually by the time of the centenary of the Origin of Species in 1959, there's almost nobody working on Darwin in the academic history of evolution. The new hotness then is all around searches for DNA, right? The idea that now biochemistry and X-ray crystallography and techniques like that, that's going to tell you about the mechanisms of evolution. And so Darwin is, on the one hand, a kind of omnipresent cultural figure, but on the other hand, he's not where the action is. And I've mentioned Darwin's notebooks, for example. Those really only came to notice in the late 1960s, when the family finally made them available to what's now the Natural History Museum. Some of them, it seemed, had been sealed. And so you had this thing where sources that are now the go-to, right? The notebooks, the lettered labeled notebooks that Darwin kept through the 1830s and 40s, people simply didn't know that those existed and survived. And so it's sort of after 1968 or so that stuff begins to become available, begins to be published in transcription in various academic journals. And that's when Darwin studies really sort of kicks off as a field again. Whereas hitherto, you know, they'd survived, they'd been known about privately, but they weren't available in a scholarly sense. So that's Darwin, right? And even he is neglected. The reason these figures fall out of that is it takes another 20 years until kind of the late 1980s for people to, once there's a revived interest in the history of evolution, that it's not just a quaint bit of 19th century stuff, but the real action is in modern physical science analysis of life, that people start to go back and you get a kind of shift to social and cultural histories, which then, want to trace origin, want to look at works like Vestiges, and then these intermediate works, Phillips and Mackey, there's very little on them at all yet. So this is sort of just the next wave. Figures like Lamarck have drawn attention, not because people thought it was particularly important to write about Lamarck, but because Lamarckism was important. The whole episode in Soviet history where it was felt to be preferable to bourgeois Darwinism, the closest thing you've had to kind of state Marxist policy on scientific doctrine. People interested in how the Soviet Union worked, therefore needed to know how Lamarck worked. That interest didn't originally come from intellectual historians or historians of science, let's say. So often it's only really something much further down the line that somebody is eventually minded to follow up on its antecedents, is how you get there. Sorry, Daniel, I'm mindful of time. I think we're 10 minutes over now. Is that enough of an answer for you?
Akash, I think. Well, I think
Yes,
he also
sorry, I
asked.
can't see you speaking.
Oh.
Yeah, is that right?
Yes, no, that's a great answer. Yes. Well, I think he also asked maybe a bit about any contact or influence between Darwin and Marx directly.
Yeah. Okay. So just to pick up on that then, there was a tendency at the time to, I mean, Marx has some throwaway comments on Darwin, but by and large, from memory, it's on the lines of like, this is further confirmation of what we already know about social and human affairs. So one interesting thing, so we've mentioned Malthus a few times. So Malthus's essay on the principle of population is one of the most influential texts of the 19th century because it spells out as a matter of mathematical necessity that populations will grow up until the point that they reach starvation. And essentially a lot of mid-century political economy is trying to respond to that. So the neo-Malthusians in the 1820s and 30s, figures like Francis Place, one avenue you go down is you say, okay, well, birth control should be available and acceptable. Because we don't believe that real human beings can practice the moral restraint that Malthus would prescribe. When you get figures like Herbert Spencer later in the century or Francis Galton, figures that are associated with social Darwinism as we now understand it, often that's presented as, an inappropriate application of Darwin to matters of political economy or social affairs. One thing that came out of this post-1960s revisionist scholarship on Darwin was to say, well, the sort of the bourgeois liberal political economy was already there. Like Darwin is reading William Paley alongside Malthus. Like the trope of competition being inevitable and inescapable on a long enough timeline is to therefore, for Marx, or let's say later Marxists, to then view Darwinian evolution as kind of bourgeois capitalists is they didn't know it because we didn't know it about Darwin at the time, but they kind of, yeah, it's because it's there. It's a heavy influence. So the naturalization of competition, if you like, is something that later generations of Marxists would grapple with. I think Marx himself, yeah, didn't engage hugely with it because he felt science to be sort of so far off in the superstructure that it didn't really have any particular relevance for the material facts of production.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. We're getting very deep into Marxist philosophy here. But yeah, I want to say thank you again to Eoin for his talk and to everyone for attending. I'm also conscious of time, but as you can see on your screen, there's some links there that I encourage you all to check out. And if I may beg a little, we are a small publication. We do rely on the generosity of readers to keep going. So if you could, if you'd be interested in donating, the link is also on your screen there. Any support is most welcome indeed. But for now, thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening. And thanks, Eoin.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.